Same old man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for May 19th, 2025, and I'm Jada Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this conversation, everybody, as we are here to talk about how Jane Austen has wrecked our lives.
I'm glad you said it that way. You didn't say that Brendan Cassidy wrecked your life or anything like that.
No, Brendan never wrecks my life. He is a godsend. I don't know what I would do without Brendan.
Can say the same thing about you, Mr. Judy Duran.
I appreciate that. But Jane Austen, on the other hand, now that is a torturous if I've ever seen one. She wrecks so many lives.
We do not speak from experience.
we did not. No, but we are here to talk about the new French romantic comedy film, Jane Austen Wrecked My Life, which was recently out in theaters, distributed by Sony Pictures here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Directed by Laura Piani. I don't know if this was a debut film from her. I'm not too familiar with her as a filmmaker.
I believe it was.
Okay.
It was a debut film for Laura Piani. I'm going to double check that right now just to make sure we're not making fake news up here. But it looks like she did have a lot of work on maybe some TV series out in France and has done some written work there. But she has directed a short film. That looks to be her only directorial effort prior to Jane Austen Wrecked My Life.
Yep, I do see here it does say it is her feature-length debut.
All right,
So
well, there it is.
That is correct. The film had its world premiere at Toronto last year, the Toronto International Film Festival. And as I noted, got its release this last weekend. I think it was limited. It might actually be going wide kind of soon.
I think it is. Because I don't recall this playing in my area. And maybe it just hasn't made the rounds just yet.
Yeah, that could be the case. I do think this is coming out this weekend, the same weekend as everyone is going to see Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. So if Tom Cruise is wrecking your life, you can also go see how Jane Austen has wrecked other lives.
This is the perfect Barbenheimer. This is the new Barbenheimer. Mission Impossible wrecked my life.
Exactly. There you go. So Jane Austen Wrecked My Life from Laura Piani. If there's nothing else to lay out there, Brendan, are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's talk about a romantic comedy for once. We don't talk about these that often anymore.
I know, we really do not.
We need more. We need more of them.
We don't. I mean, they don't make a lot of rom-coms anymore, especially ones that go to theaters, although this is a French film, so Sony is certainly doing us a favor.
Little bit of a different case here, for sure. This is not a straight-to-Netflix type situation.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's more or less what I'm referencing. A lot of major U.S. studio rom-coms typically go straight to streaming these days. So
unless you're Anyone But You, which did fairly well at the box office. It's a movie I didn't love, but that showed signs that the romantic comedy still has some life.
I mean, I don't, I mean, maybe there are numbers, there are mathematicians that would prove me wrong here. I don't know. But I want to say that's a viable movie that would do well for the studios if they committed to doing more of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an appetite for them.
I mean, it's kind of like horror movies in a way, right?
Yeah.
They're made on the cheap. And people, they don't need to be big hits to be successful.
Exactly.
They just need to make enough money. And most of them do make enough money.
Yeah, I agree. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm way wrong, and there are accounting nerds out there that are yelling at me as I say those words.
Maybe Celine's song will prove us wrong with Materialist later this year.
We'll see. Maybe that will be the litmus test as we get to that later on. Right now, we are here to talk about Jane Austen Wrecked My Life. Maybe the last thing I'll note here before we go, Brendan, Jane Austen, how do you feel about Miss Austen?
I'm very much a novice. I'm very much a novice when it comes to the writings of Jane Austen. Most of my
Yeah.
familiarity with her work mostly comes down to what has already been adapted to the screen, specifically in movie form. I'm, of course, aware of her stories like Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. One of my favorite ones is the basis of her story, Lady Susan, which became Love and Friendship, the Whit Stillman film.
I love that movie so
Yeah,
much.
it's a great movie. It's a great movie. But I cannot say I'm an expert when it comes to Jane Austen, the writer. And I think that's a good thing to say up front, leading into our thoughts on Jane Austen Wreck My Life, because there are clearly parallels being drawn between that movie and the writings of Jane Austen that maybe we might be a little bit ignorant towards.
Yeah.
We're willing to admit that.
Yeah, I am with you. I am a novice when it comes to her writing work, although I am familiar with her reputation broadly speaking. But my experience with her work, as you noted, comes in film form. And we've seen countless adaptations of her works over the years. Pride and Prejudice is awesome. I love that film as well.
Yeah.
Love and Friendship is another one that's noteworthy. And I also liked the film Emma from 2020. I thought was really compelling as well.
Yeah, that's a good call. Good call.
So yeah, there's been some great ones that we've seen over the years for sure. All right. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into Jane Austen Wrecked My Life. As we noted, written and directed by Laura Piani, it stars Camille Rutherford, Pablo Pauly, Charlie Anson, and a few others that come and go throughout the film, but it's primarily that trio that we'll be focusing on for this conversation. If you're not familiar with Jane Austen Wrecked My Life, a desperately single bookseller lost in a fantasy world finds herself forced to fulfill her dreams of becoming a writer in order to stop messing up her love life. Okay, let's talk about this one. Brennan, what did you think about Jane Austen Wrecked My Life?
I enjoyed it, and it's a very easy movie to recommend, which is actually really refreshing, right? We often talk about movies on this podcast that you and I might love, but maybe they're not for everybody. I feel like this is a movie I could recommend to just about everybody, and I think most people will get some level of enjoyment out of it. It is a French movie, but it does sort of have a familiarity when it comes to how rom-coms usually flow and how they function. It is pulling from the rom-com DNA in a way that I think makes it very accessible and very enjoyable. I also think the film is pretty clever at drawing these parallels to Jane Austen's work within a modern context, as I'm sure we'll talk about further. While we are novices when it comes to Jane Austen's work, it is still pretty obvious to see parallels between this story and, let's say, the works of like Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion. Even this film's main character, by the name of Agatha, played by Camilla Rutherford, compares herself to the main character from Persuasion as well. So it is very clearly drawing parallels to some of those narrative tropes that Jane Austen would essentially invent in her time. And I think the film does a neat job showcasing how timeless her work was, while also still being very much of the times. And I think it draws that line pretty interestingly. The movie is also just quite funny. I laughed a lot during this. I think that really is maybe the biggest selling point. There are sequences like a car breaking down that leads to a very funny excursion between two characters that I really enjoyed. There's a voiceover sequence where we hear Agatha essentially fabricating what these other writers at this Jane Austen retreat are basically telling themselves, and it's so pompous that you can't help but wonder it's just her imagining how pompous that they are. And I found that really funny and really clever. So there are a lot of clever things here that I found really refreshing for a romantic comedy like this. Certainly not perfect. There are things it does and maybe some corners it cuts to get to certain dramatic resolutions that I didn't necessarily love, but maybe that's kind of the Jane Austen way, and I'm willing to admit my ignorance. Maybe that is ultimately the point. We could talk about that further.
Sure.
But I did enjoy this one quite a bit.
Yeah, I liked it as well. I think it's really charming. It's thoughtful at times. It's clearly made with affection for Austen and her legacy. That said, I do think it is marred by some pretty trite romantic comedy conventions. The
That's
humor
fair.
didn't quite land for me like it did for you, at least
Okay.
consistently. I did find it flat and overly staged. There is a llama sequence in this film, for example, that I
Oh,
think
that
is
did not work for
really
me at
bad.
all. I did not
That
that
is
that did not work for me at all.
horribly staged, horribly edited.
It
It's
it
not good at
it is
all.
clearly relying on the cuteness of those animals to get by. But
Yeah.
I'm with you. I found that kind of awkward.
Yeah, and I think primarily it's awkward because the filmmaking is not great. It is
Mhm,
manufactured. You can see the mechanics of the film really working in
mhm,
moments like that. So from a comedic standpoint, from a conventional standpoint, I do think this film does suffer at times. Many of the supporting characters, I think, also lean into modern rom com stereotypes that certainly don't feel authentically Austinian. The pacing and tone can sometimes clash as well.
mhm.
However, where this film really works is with Agatha. I do
Sure,
really like
sure.
Agatha as a character here. She is a hopeless romantic. She is someone who has let the idea of perfect storybook love distort her expectations of what a real connection is. And that's where the title becomes meaningful. Maybe Jane Austen wrecked her life not because she's lost some love, but because she's chased idealized versions of it. And I do like
Mhm.
how this film really gets into that with Agatha. And also I appreciate that the film resists giving her this tidy romantic ending. She doesn't settle, even though she really could. There are two men that are potentially involved with her romantically without getting into any sort of spoilers.
Mhm.
And there is one character in particular that she has a clear bond with, as we see at the beginning of the film. And there comes a moment halfway through where she could simply settle for that option, but she refuses,
Mhm.
um, partially because, again, of this distorted expectation she has with love. And then with the other one, there comes a moment at the end of the film where she could simply settle for that as well, but instead walks away to a different life at the end of the film. And I do like how it is, in the end, less about these romantic interests and it's more about her reclaiming her voice as a writer. Those moments at the end of the film and how it chooses independence and inspiration over traditional romantic tropes,
Mhm.
I think is extremely refreshing, especially when you couple that with, as you noted, the clear parallels to Agatha and
Yeah.
other heroines in Austen's work. Again, not that I know that too deeply, but broadly speaking, we know those characters well enough that you can
Yeah.
sense those parallels, you can see those parallels. And that to me is where this film is riveting. And I did enjoy that about the film.
I think the ending does help tie a lot of these things together, whether it be thematically or even emotionally. Because leading up to that, I was hoping to get a little bit more insight into Agatha's ability as a writer, which the film doesn't really give us. We sort of just have to take at face value that she's
Yeah.
apparently really good at writing. But when we get to those final moments and the film is more interested in her maybe disillusioned view of modern relationships and love when compared to how she views it as sort of idyllic when looking at the works of Jane Austen, right? There is a bit of a bridge there, a bit of a gap that separates the two. And I think that's where we start to get an understanding of what is inspiring her. There's actually a great line towards the end where I think she says something along the lines of, I thought I had to experience interesting things to be able to write, but now I know that's all bullshit.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
realization I think is very insightful. That while a lot of the work of Jane Austen and the way that she portrayed relationships was very much of the time, and there is still something you could take away from it nowadays. it is still very much of the time and can also lead to a very
Mhm.
dangerous, unrealistic version of what love is. And that idea of being disappointed with reality is very much, I guess, kind of a Jane Austen thing,
Yeah.
but taken through a more modern lens. So the film does a really interesting thing by, in a way, adapting the themes of Jane Austen, but also deconstructing them. And
Yeah.
I think that ending does a great job pulling all of those things together, which is why it does crystallize in a very poetic way. I do agree
Yeah.
with you. I think that's really quite great.
Well, and what's interesting as it relates to that deconstruction that you're talking about, that's where I'm left wrestling with this film
Okay.
and its title, how Jane Austen is applied to this film with Agatha, because we learn early on, we see early on, and I just noted this in the synopsis, she is a bookseller.
Mhm.
And the film presents to us that she is a huge Jane Austen fan and expert. And yet, throughout a lot of this film, I feel like we are left questioning that. At least I was left questioning that.
Oh, I was too. Yeah.
You
It's
know,
not very clear on, what that expertise really is.
yeah, because Jane Austen, her work sometimes has been mistaken for fluffy romances. And I think from
Mhm.
a broad perspective, that is easy to understand, but they're really more grounded and ironic, and they challenge romantic norms. Austen often critiques the idea of romantic idealism and denotes that love isn't about perfection, but rather it's about compatibility and self awareness and timing and morality.
Mhm.
Agatha's desire for romance is very understandable. Obviously, we all have those shared experiences, but her
Sure.
perspective of it, at least given the evidence we see in this film, it isn't rooted in Jane Austen. So, how exactly did Jane Austen wreck her life? Is it because Agatha fundamentally misinterprets Austen as a writer? Well, those early scenes with Felix don't seem to imply that. And the way she pushes back against Oliver on the car ride also suggests that she does understand Austen's work. There's a
Yeah.
dichotomy with Agatha that I don't know if it is poorly conceived or if that contradiction makes the character more fascinating. I'm
I
honestly
I I
still
think it's
wrestling with
I think
that.
it's a little bit of both. What I
Yeah.
took from it was that sometimes you can understand someone's work so well that it forces you to then almost misinterpret it because you're looking at what made it work of a particular time and not how it translates to a new time. And in a way, I think that's Agatha's flaw in many ways. She's sort of stuck in the past. And she is a character that is stuck in the past. So she's really only drawn to what Jane Austen may have represented back when she was still living and writing these legendary works, but not how it
Yep,
could be
maybe.
yeah, and not how it can be reinterpreted in this modern way, which is where this movie's attempts at
Yeah.
both adapting and deconstructing those Jane Austen themes comes into play, and
Yeah.
why it is trying to have it both ways. It might not be all that successful in balancing all that, but I think that is its intent.
Well, and I think that's what's interesting because there really is no doubt that Agatha is looking for some sort of fantasy,
Yeah.
as evidenced by the film's magical realism, which you noted earlier. Particularly, I think of that moment when she's writing her novel, those first few chapters in the restaurant. That
Mhm.
scene I do think is striking. Also
Agreed.
evidenced by the conversation she has early on with the Felix character, or by the way she aggressively wants to enter into this game being played by the Cheryl and Beth characters.
Mhm.
And this, it's some sort of role playing game, and when she is hearing it from a distance, she finds it tantalizing, and so
Yeah.
she joins into the game, and her character wants to pursue this guy romantically, but when she rolls the dice and the outcome isn't ideal, she immediately quits the game and leaves.
Mhm.
So maybe I'm just a dumb male in this equation, I'm willing to admit, but it sure does look like there's a disparity between reality and what she's looking for internally. And I just don't see the connection to Austen, at least with how Austen would give her an expectation for her life to be wrecked. But again, maybe that is the point, as you noted. Maybe her desires have conflated with Austen's work to romanticize the world of her novels.
Yeah, I
And
think
she missed,
she's over heightening those ideas of Jane Austen in a way that actually falsifies them as in
yeah,
a modern lens.
absolutely. And it ultimately leaves her at a crossroads at the end of the film where she has to let go of that idea of love and give in to the cynical realism that is depicted in Austen's novels,
Yeah.
which is ultimately how this film ends. So that deconstruction, I do think ultimately is effective. And that's why I said I was wrestling with it, because throughout so much of this film, it does seem as if Jane Austen ruining her life or reckoning her life, that seems like a red herring or misinformation. Like, it just seems like it's not applicable to Agatha given her
Yeah.
desires.
I
But
think
I
it's
think
her.
by the end of the
Yeah.
film, there is kind of this weird flipping of the coin that makes sense of those
It's
choices.
it's like her refusing to put the blame on herself. And
Yeah.
and I think that's where the film is at its most effective, and why it is actually kind of a fascinating one to talk about. There is a little bit of sophistication here that I do appreciate. Really, where the film started to lose me, and these are really small things, but the film does spend a lot of time emphasizing on the dread of these particular situations. And I say this carefully because I don't know if these are Jane Austen tropes that the film is trying to pay homage to, but this film does go out of its way to give Agatha a very clear backstory involving her parents and a car accident that
Yeah.
I don't think is needed at all.
No, I
Yeah.
agree.
Unless it's, again, it goes back to that quote I mentioned earlier, how she feels like she needs to experience interesting things in order to write. So maybe that's one of those quote unquote interesting things that are actually meant to be seen as futile. You don't need those things. So if it is there to make that point, I guess I can appreciate that. But it relishes in these forms of drama as a way to progress characters forward that I don't think are necessary. We even get the Oliver character and the failing health of his dad, which feels very futile as well. One of the characters, one of the women at this residency, you find out is actually taking IVF, and nothing comes of that either.
Yeah.
There are moments here where I feel like the film is cutting corners to manufacture drama that I just didn't think was necessary, and I don't know if they are there to pay homage to certain narrative tropes that would exist in a Jane Austen story. You get the love triangle here. That's very much a Jane
Right.
Austen type thing. You get some of the themes on self-discovery and disappointment in reality and women's roles and classism. You get all those things here as well. I just don't know if you needed to, you know, cheapen the drama a little bit. They felt like cheat codes in a way, and those are the things that bugged me the most, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, and I think that's very fair, and that's why I go back to what is the motivation with Agatha here, because
hmm
the connection to Jane Austen feels a little misplaced until we have these revelations at the end of the film. And I think, to your point, as far as what Agatha sees and experiences at this estate,
Yeah.
maybe it is less about contriving drama, because I agree with you. If that is the purpose, then it does feel manufactured.
hmm
But there comes that reveal at the end of the film, and you alluded to this earlier, where she realizes that she doesn't have to have certain experiences to write.
Yeah.
It's simply about her manifesting it through her own abilities and her own emotions. And some of the quirks we learn about these characters, again, if it's meant for to be dramatic, it doesn't work. But if it's
hmm
just about giving these characters personality traits or quirks or something that Agatha can ascertain, that ultimately leads to that revelation, that epiphany of, I don't really need to learn anything, then I do see why those things
Yeah.
are included
It's
here,
almost like they're using them ironically as opposed
Yes.
to making true drama out of it.
which is a Jane Austen trait.
Sure.
So
Sure.
again, that's where the film I do think is fascinating in terms of its dichotomy of using modern rom-com tropes and how that kind of applies. Because I mean, as I was watching this film, and I would imagine a lot of people might feel the same, it feels more conventional and modern in terms of a rom-com than it feels like a Jane Austen thing until you
Sure.
get to the end.
Yeah.
And you
Till you get
see
to the
how
ball
it's all,
scene. Yeah.
yeah, that's how it's all
And-
recontextualized.
And then the way that Felix enters the picture once again, you actually get this real life love triangle forming here. And also the way that Felix acts when he re-enters the film, like obviously he's very excited to tap into this romantic kinship with Agatha, but all of a sudden the character becomes an asshole, like for a little bit, which I don't know if that's the film once again cutting corners, but it's kind of interesting, and I can feel the Jane Austen imprint in that final act in those kind of examples. But you're right, leading up to that, it feels very much like a traditional rom-com of the modern day and age
Yeah.
before it doesn't, and
Yeah.
it's an interesting shift of pace.
Yeah, absolutely. And that element when Felix comes in, because I do think those early scenes between the two of them are really great. And you are left questioning why they're not together because they are touchy-feely, they're physically close to each other. There seems to be some sort of emotional connection, but they're not
Right.
together romantically. So how the film builds up to that, it does make sense to me. Felix somewhat becoming a different character. Okay, I can work with it given those opening scenes, but I was left wondering how this ties into her this perfect circumstance that she's waiting for. Because it does seem like Felix is someone that she could be with, or Oliver, given how they both feel like broken pieces. Maybe that's what bonds them together. You can see the film kind of forming that as well. And it's just like, okay, so far, like at that point in the film, Agatha seems like anything other than a Jane Austen character. Which
she doesn't seem much like a Jane Austen character, but I think the love triangle seems to be straddling that line between a Jane Austen situation and then a more modern version of it that deconstructs those ideas. So perhaps
by the end, and that's why I keep going to, as anyone listening to this that's going to check out this movie, or maybe you've already seen the film, but and maybe you had the same experience that I did, but there's watching this film was two different experiences. There was everything up until we got to the ending. And then when the credits rolled, I was like, okay, it all is starting to come together. But it's one of those movies where you really do have to wait to the end because the final 10 minutes of this film is what brings everything together. And the comedy and some of the tonal inconsistencies, that's a criticism I'll always have of the film.
That's par for the course for most romantic comedies anyway.
For sure. But as far as the DNA of this film and whether it works or doesn't work, I really think comes down to this film sticking the landing. And I think it does, which is ultimately why I liked the film. But that's why I go back to that dichotomy and where I was left wrestling with this film is it's I guess the irony of Agatha being presented as this huge Austen fan, yet in her life, she doesn't really represent Jane Austen in any way, shape, or form. And until the end, then it kind of clicks.
Yeah. It seems as though Felix and Oliver in this love triangle kind of represent both paths of that spectrum, where one maybe is more of the traditional route for her to pursue, the other one being a bit more of that deconstructionist route that's a more modern look at romances and disregards the sort of illusion she has developed on what a Jane Austen romance ultimately is and what it was. So like
Yeah.
I think they're like one thing I will appreciate about this movie is even though it is utilizing a love triangle, and that's kind of a tired trope for romantic comedies, it does add a symbolic purpose to it here, which I did
Yeah.
kind of like.
No, I agree. I agree. And as we noted earlier, Jane Austen is known for challenging norms and
Hmm.
being ironic. That's where this film ultimately lands. As far as how it challenges norms, it's nothing intuitive. I don't think it's reinventing the wheel by any means,
No,
but I think where it ultimately goes in the end, it's endearing enough. Like there's still an
sure.
affable quality to it. And I do like the performance by Camille Rutherford. She's fantastic in this film.
Hmm.
And I particularly like those final 10, 15 minutes and how she chooses. I think about that close up as she walks away at the end of the film there from Oliver, and a Hollywood, like there's a Hollywood version of this where it cuts back to Oliver and he has some sort of epiphany and he
Yeah.
makes a different choice than what he does there. But I love that the camera sticks with Agatha as she walks away there, and we just cut to her finishing her novel in her apartment by herself
Hmm.
and coming to terms with love as this imperfect thing that she has to deal with. But it's something that isn't defining to her anymore, like on an individual level, but instead it's like fueling her artistic integrity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That
I
makes
like that about
sense.
the film. You know what I
And
mean?
I think she does have good chemistry with both Felix and Oliver, but in different ways, in
Yeah,
very
I
different
agree.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think aside from that central dichotomy that we've kind of exhausted here,
Hmm.
the other thing that I would be curious to look back on, especially on a rewatch, if I was to ever give this one a go again,
Hmm.
is some of these other supporting characters and some of the, I don't know if I want to say dramatic tension, but there's conversations that Agatha has with some of these other writers. There's one in particular. Is it the Beth character? I'm
Is
trying to
it
recall here.
is
But
Beth the one that was very politically strong-willed, and then you find out she's taking IVF? Is that the one you were thinking of, the blonde?
I think so. I think so. But that is the
Okay.
character. I don't know if
Okay.
that's her name, but that is the character that I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Where there's some verbal sparring between her and Agatha.
Yeah.
Again, like dramatically, it doesn't really go anywhere, but does that ultimately help lead to some of the revelations that she has at the end? That's the stuff that I like to parse out a little bit more and kind
Me
of
too. I can't
digest
tell if
on.
it's frivolous or if it actually is leading to
Yeah.
that revelation that we're alluding to by the end. And if it is ultimately, like I mentioned that quote earlier, that Agatha feels like she needs to experience interesting things in order to write, and then realizes that's not the case at all. Are these individual character detours versions of those interesting things that she thinks she needs to flesh out? And are those just, futile? And is the point that they're futile? And maybe that
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it kind of does feel a little modern Jane Austen-y to me,
Hmm.
because you know, I, I do love that the end of this film is like romance. Eh. like
Who needs it?
there's
Who
kind of
needs it?
like this apathetic notion toward it, even
Yeah.
though that's like a lot of her writing is like that's what it's about in some ways. But I don't know. I find that duality interesting here.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm. Yeah, it's very Jane Austen, but also being very anti Jane Austen at the same time. At least it
yeah,
seems like it's trying to be.
yeah. But there's like an honesty to it that I think is interesting too.
Mhm.
At least with Agatha, as far as her wrestling with
Yeah, yeah. Camille
how,
Rutherford brings a lot of conviction here,
yeah,
and makes you believe that.
yeah, I agree. And then the last thing I just want to reiterate, and it's something that you brought up earlier, is the magical realism. There's quite a few instances of it here.
Mhm.
I do think it's really well used.
Agreed.
That
Yeah.
The scene that you brought up earlier when she's walking through the yard there and she's hearing all of the voices of the people who are writing and it feels very pompous, that I thought was really clever. That was one of my favorite scenes in the film as well.
Yeah.
And I do think that restaurant scene does a great job of denoting that she lives in a fantasy world, at least at the beginning of the film.
It sets the stage very well.
Yeah. So I do like that. I think it works really well here, and again, kind of helps alleviate some of those conventional tropes that we get a little bit later. So
yeah, I agree with that.
I did like it. I did like it on the whole. A few things to wrestle with, but on the whole, I very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too.
Okay. Any other final thoughts?
I do think Pablo Pauly and Charlie Anson are both quite good as Felix and Oliver, respectively. I don't think we really called their names out, but I think it's worth giving them credit too.
Yep, I agree. I do like the performances on the whole. Yeah, good stuff. This is coming to theaters very soon, as we noted. Definitely give it a go. I think it's worth your time.
Absolutely.
All right. Jane Austen wrecked my life, sort of, kind of, in a way, but not really. All of the above.
If the movie were terrible, then yes, it did wreck our lives. It's not terrible.
No. Good stuff. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hit us up, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. All right. The main show this week, episode 637, we talked about our top 5 characters that we want to see get the Andor treatment, which is to say to get a spin-off movie or TV show like a Cassian Andor. That was really, really fun. Really enjoyed that. We will also have a review of Final Destination Bloodlines coming, so you can be on the lookout for that as well. And New Women in Session at the end of the week, as always. So lots going on. Also, stay tuned to InSessionFilm.com. Our writers always doing great work.
Yeah, great stuff.
We do have a written review for Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning, that is up already at InSessionFilm.com. We'll have a podcast review of that coming soon as well. Okay, with that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Jane Austen can wreck my life.
Unless I gotta read her books.